we'll approach this game from the top like I would approach any logic game. We'll walk through it using a whiteboard and such. But after that, and with that context in mind, I want to actually take a step back and see what could we do regarding our overall logic games process to take the Socratic review method and apply it to logic games, which I haven't really actually tried to do before because it's so different in nature from reasoning and reading comprehension, not nearly as much in terms of language dissection as we typically do, but a lot more in terms of what is our process, initial paragraph, rules, questions, diagramming process. So we'll look at that in mind. So as we're working through this now, please keep in mind how the game is hitting you, even if you've done it before. Maybe it's been a while, maybe not, but think back to the first time you approached this particular game that I put in the chat and see how you felt about it from every step of the way. So link to the game is in the chat. I'm going to pull up a whiteboard and we'll walk through it together. I'm going to give everybody about 3 minutes just to do the initial setup, diagramming the rules, making inferences, connecting things together, and then we'll talk about it together. So I'll give you about 3 minutes. Just let me know when you're done setting it up. If you're not familiar with this game type or you're not comfortable with it, totally fine too. We'll walk through every single detail. All right, so I'll start just talking in general without getting to too many details until more folks are ready. But this game, initial impressions of it in terms of how you would feel: easy, difficult, game type, major elements, even just an initial paragraph, what might be a trick or trap. Alana says, I love it. Fantastic. I love it too, but I wrote it, so I'm likely to think that. Billy says, in, out. Yes. What makes it in, out?
Then, I mean, conditional statements, pretty much. Because if then, you say is in, if this is in, is out.
Nice. Okay, so a little choppy, but I think I got the major point of what you were saying. Lots of conditional statements. We have a positive negative relationship going on here. So positives and negatives, but it's binary, for and against. That's all that we have going on here. They're voted on, for and against, conditional statements, and the word if, lots of if statements as well, as Carolina pointed out. Exactly. So conditional rules. As Alan said, it's tricky because there is the word unless that we're dealing with. Ariel says conditional statements. Yeah, awesome. So the unless makes it trickier. The conditionals makes it relatively more likely to be in, out. A lot of conditional logic games are primarily, if not entirely, in, out. And if you can group into that general category, one of the benefits is that you can place this game in the bucket of many previous logic games that are similar to it, at least roughly. So one expectation you can have is that you'll be able to link together most, if not all, of the rules together in long conditional chains. We'll get to the variables in a minute where we see some indications of that, but one thing I thought that was a little bit tricky about this game is it says, starts off very first words, on Wednesday. That's a red herring. Wednesday is completely irrelevant. There are no other references to days of the week anywhere else in this game. We could have cut those first 2 words and it would have been the same all overall. So days of the week can be an indication of ordering because it involves chronology. But in this particular case, that's a side issue and it's meant to throw you off. Games do occasionally do that. So, and there, by the way, process games, if I understand them to be pattern games as I know them, then there are a number of pattern games, which are rare but tough, where they involve a day of the week or a day in general, but what happens between days is irrelevant. So just something to keep in mind there. But anyway, 7 bills, 7 variables, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. The bills are voted on with the following conditions being the rules. So you list the variables, nothing else to take out of the initial paragraph. Occasionally, you might see other rules buried in there, but in this case, we don't have that. So we could go on to the rules at this point. First rule, G, only if against E. Votes for gun control only if against environment. So gun, arrow, not environment. You could start off right there. Positive, arrow, negative. To make it in, out, I would make for positive, against negative. You can lay it out right there. Thing with putting it here is that we don't have a lot of room to the left. And if we want to be able to link other rules onto this, we might want to allow a little bit more space so that we can build on from the beginning. For example, the fourth rule says votes for gun if votes for both H and D. So that means if H and D, then G. And I'll talk more about that rule in a minute, but the thing is, we have G here, we have G there. You would then need to draw something like that, which is pretty messy. I wouldn't want you to do that on test day. I don't even want to do it now. So what I'm going to do instead then is say, well, let's be clever from the beginning and allow for the possibility that we may need space on both sides. So instead, I'm going to do smaller G arrow, not E, and then we'll have room on both the left and the right. And maybe we'll have to build all the way to the right with lots of things, in which case we would then want to shift it all over to the left. So if we have to do that, we'll have to do that. Good news is on the flex, you get 5 sheets of scratch paper, double-sided, 10 pages, plenty of space. So if you have to just make a big X and then start over, you have the space to do that. Will you have the time? That's a separate question. But if you work efficiently and you don't make your diagrams too elaborate, you will have both then time and space to do what you got to do. Anyway, that's the first rule. Now, you could just list the second rule and the third rule and the fourth, list them all out, and then make contrapositives afterwards, link things together afterwards. But that takes time. So I wouldn't want you to bother doing that. I'd rather you just make contrapositives and link everything together from the beginning. As for what is the contrapositive, it's a logically equivalent way of laying out the conditional statement that appears different. And because it appears different, it's another useful framing to have separately. As for DePauli's question, do you need to lay them out? I'd recommend it. I'd recommend it because let's say we have a rule that says E, then X, just to make something up. Well, we've got E here positive, we have E here negative. Those can't be linked as they are right now because they're not the same truth value, meaning they're not both positive and they're not both negative. So there's not a good way to link them automatically here. But if instead we said we had a positive framing of the variable E or negative framing of the variable E, if we had another rule saying not E, then something, then you could link them together because those are the same, negative E, negative E. So we'll get there as to how this actually happens. We'll see that things do in fact link. But to start with, simply what is the contrapositive of this particular rule? G arrow, not E. Yes, linking does happen in a lot of questions as well, Ariel. Yes, exactly. So the chat's blowing up. A lot of folks, Jack, Casey, Anika, Alan, all saying E arrow, not G. That's correct. Well done. So the way you take the contrapositive is you reverse and negate. You switch the order of the variables around the arrows and you negate both. So what was negative, like negative E, now becomes positive E. It was at the end before. Now it's at the beginning. G was positive and at the beginning before. Now it's negative at the end. So we've translated it with a logically equivalent statement that looks different. And it's useful because now if we have another rule involving positive E, we can link it on the bottom chain, what will become a chain as we link on more and more conditional statements. Similarly, if we have a rule saying negative G, we can now link that with what we already have here. And we'll see that there are, in fact, other rules that contain those exact variables framed in that way. For example, the third rule says votes for either environment or judicial activism or both. So environment is positive in the third rule. It was negative in the first rule, but now that we have the contrapositive, where E is positive, that then smoothly links with it. So it's nice to have. Questions regarding the contrapositive? Okay, so let's get into the second rule now. Second rule says against J, then for I. So negative J, positive I. The word unless obviously complicates things as well. Not a simple if-then statement. The most likely interpretation of a rule like this, and I almost fell for it myself even though I wrote this rule, is if not J, then I. That's incorrect though, because the first word here is not the word if, it's the word unless. Requires a separate kind of translation. The word unless is one of those annoying words like except, until, and without. It's not straightforwardly a necessary condition indicator or a sufficient condition indicator. It's something else altogether that I'll get into in a moment. Unless, simplest translation, by the way, is to say if not. And to insert the phrase if not for unless, much easier to translate. But I wouldn't even deal with this rule yet because it mentions variables I don't already have on this diagram. I want to be able to link things smoothly as I go. Using J and I and looking at those now is not going to serve me in that end, so I'll skip it, come back to it later. Yes, Alana, question?
Yeah, so when I did this, I wrote two translations of this rule because I was like, this is when I get caught doing the wrong translation. So I'm going to write what I think it is, but then I'm going to do what I was taught to do around the if not. And so when I initially wrote it, I did what you said is incorrect, the not J, then I.
Yeah.
But then when I did the contrapositive of that, that's not I, then J, which is actually what I got when I did the if not. Right? So can you explain a little bit?
Yeah, we'll translate this rule in a second. I won't actually go through the exact order I would do it on test day, though.
Okay.
But we'll come back to the second rule, and I'll translate the second rule correctly using if not and then another method also. But either way, it does turn out different than doing if not.
Okay.
So then just saying unless equals if. Unless equaling if and unless equaling if not will totally different outcomes. We'll get there. So again, I would skip the second rule, go on to the third rule because the third rule has E. The letter E, environment. We have E environment here as well. Those will link smoothly. Now, the third rule is saying votes for either E as an environment, J, or both. This is tough because it's not a conditional framing, even though it's a conditional idea. What are they doing here? They're establishing a minimum. You've got to have at least one of environment or judicial, and then both would be okay too. The or both meaning they are not mutually exclusive. So you could have both, and you've got to have at least one. Now, at least one means negative, arrow, positive. If you don't have one, then you must have the other. Very difficult concept for a lot of folks to get. We're much more used to dealing with conflicts, which are totally different. This is at least one in, by the way. At least one out is positive, arrow, negative, which is exactly like this thing, the first rule we have, G and negative E. If you have G, you cannot have negative E. If you have environment, you cannot have gun control, mutually exclusive. That's not what this new rule is saying, though. This new rule is saying specifically at least one in, negative, arrow, positive. So they're saying if you don't have environment, you must have judicial. Where does that link on smoothly here? Not environment, then judicial.
On that
yes?
first conditional. On that top conditional, if G, then not E, then J.
Perfect. Exactly. You got it, Alyssa. Fantastic. So gun control, then not environment, then positive judicial. Fantastic, exactly. Now, once again, we can take the contrapositive specifically of this part in order to link it in smoothly with the bottom chain. So what would the contrapositive of this boxed area be? Same process like before, contrapositive translation, reverse, then negate. Anika's got it, fantastic. Not J, then E. I see Lindsay and Marissa have it too, fantastic. So not E, then J, contrapositive, not J, then E. So we started off with negative E. We now have positive E. We ended before with negative J, with positive J. Now we begin with negative J. So reversing the order, negating, they're like mirror images of each other. Now, as for the couple questions in the chat here, Natalie's saying, how would you incorporate the or both? Good news is you don't have to. In logic, the word or implicitly includes the possibility of both. In everyday language, we might say to a kid, like, do you want cookies or ice cream? Good news for kids on the LSAT is that kids can have both. LSAT's fun, see kids? So cookies or ice cream, you can have both. That is inclusive in logic, simply because logicians way back when said they had a vote, I guess, and they decided we're going to make it inclusive. It is. Everyday language, speech, it's typically exclusive, limiting, reducing, but in logic or both, the word or includes the possibility of both. So there's nothing special at all we need to write down regarding the or both portion of this rule. And in fact, every or statement on the LSAT is already inclusive unless they specifically, explicitly state otherwise. Another question in the chat here, I saw Ariel was making a comment about how she wouldn't have thought to write this rule as a conditional statement. And yeah, I mean, it's not an obvious thing to be doing here. I think part of what makes this rule tougher in the context of this game is that it requires that kind of outside the box thinking to reframe it in that way. I did that deliberately based on my understanding of these rules. I can't say I can think of an LSAT game like this concept, but I think it's good to be able to translate forwards and backwards. So take a non-conditional framing, turn it into a conditional, and then take a conditional framing and frame it in a non-conditional way. So just a flexible approach here. I had a request to write out this third rule in isolation separately. So I'll just quickly jot this down on the side. Negative E, then positive J. Contrapositive, negative J, then positive E. I'm not writing down all the rules on the side and then doing contrapositive, then combining, because I want to better reflect the process on test day that I think is closer to ideal. But of course, for illustrative purposes, I'm happy to do that for any of these rules. But you see, by skipping the second rule, going straight to the third, we can smoothly link the first and third rules together. At this point, we could go back into the second rule and link it, since we now have the letter J already on our new diagram. And so I'll go back and do that. Otherwise, of course, it would have been fine to skip that second rule, come back to it at the end, and then smoothly link it in. But we could do it now too. So unless against J, then positive I. Like I said, simplest way to translate unless is unless equals if not. So if we say if not against J, then for I. So if not against J, double negative, if not against. Since she's voting on bills, either for or against, simplest translation would be, well, if she's not against, then she is for. So we could say if for J, then for I. Simply stated, J requires I. We already have positive J at the end of the top chain. So we can simply link in positive I. What's the contrapositive of this? J arrow I. So we have a positive arrow, positive relationship here. Switch the order, meaning reverse and negate. A lot of folks in the chat got it. Matthew, Tyler, Lindsay, DePauli, fantastic. Not I, arrow, not J. So it becomes negative I, arrow, negative J. We already have negative J right here, beginning of the bottom chain. So we can simply attach negative I to the beginning of that. So they're building bit by bit, and once again, they are mirror images of each other, reflections. If we have a positive I at the end of the top chain, we then have a negative I at the beginning of the bottom chain. If we have J second to last and positive on the top chain, we then have negative J second to first, meaning second, and negative at the beginning of the bottom chain. So they are the reversals and negations of each other. As for the question, someone chatted me, how does J lead to I? It's because when we take unless to equal if not at the beginning of the second rule, if not voting against judicial means she votes for judicial. So unless equaling if not gives us an if at the beginning of the second rule here. And the not against, meaning for, is a double negative. They cancel each other out. So we just simply get if J, then I. Now I said there are two ways to translate unless. One would simply be unless equals if not. Another way is to take the word unless as introducing the necessary condition, and then you negate the other part of the rule, in this case, the part after the comma involving immigration, to make it the sufficient. It's confusing. I think unless equaling if not is simpler, but the more complicated way more often leads to a smoother result. I'll write this out briefly on the side here. This is typically more important in a logical reasoning context than a logic games context, but it does come up sometimes. So as Alyssa's writing in the chat, she does this that way also. Unless introducing the necessary, then negate the other part to make it into the sufficient. So if we have unless not J, then I. This is pretty much what the second rule says. I'd say, okay, well, unless is our arrow, introducing the necessary not J, then the other part, the I negate that, and by negating it, I make it into the sufficient. So I, when negated, becomes not I. So you see, we ended up with not I, arrow, not J, just like we have at the beginning of the bottom chain. In this particular instance, it did not lead to what I would consider a smoother result. Typically it does, this case not, but either way, what we have is a correct result and both methods lead to the same outcome. This one gave us what was originally our contrapositive, but it has the same truth value as the other result, J arrow I. Again, unless is typically more important in a logical reasoning context, but it does happen to come up sometimes in games, as it did here. We've got most of the rules here. There's only one more. One more question related from Marisa here. Can I replace all the words unless, until, without, except with if not? Yes. If not equals unless, except, until, without. Simple to remember, simpler to understand perhaps, maybe easier to apply. Like I said, typically does not lead to as clean a result. But then if your result is not clean, just take the contrapositive. By clean, I mean more positive framing on average, typically easier to think in positive terms than negative terms. So if I get a result with tons of negatives or the framing is kind of backwards, I might then want to do contrapositive just to have a smoother thing to look at and deal with. I'm looking at your chat, Alana. You wrote, did you mean to write K there? Okay. If not,
Yeah,
not
no,
J, okay. If not J, then J. Yeah. So if not J is a double negative, same meaning as positive J.
See, I do know how to do this. It's a lot of it is like I get like I really know my stuff and then I lose confidence and it's like, yeah, I did this correctly the first time. So it's always what I do is I take that as an if not, and then I negate the statement that the necessary, like you were saying.
Cool. I mean, that works.
I know it's a little harder, but it's the way I remember it. So then if not, then it's an actual positive, and that's how you're getting the if J, then I.
Right.
Okay. Got it.
Cool. All right. So last rule, if she votes for gun control, if votes for both health and defense. So one thing that might make this tricky is if is in the middle. So if introduces our sufficient condition, meaning if she votes for both H and D, health and defense, then gun. So on the side, like I wrote earlier, H and D, then positive G. I'm writing this to the side separately at first, simply because it's a little bit confusing, a little bit more complicated. What this is saying, that having both H and D together is sufficient to guarantee G. The two of them together form the sufficient condition. H alone is not sufficient to guarantee G, and D alone is not sufficient to guarantee G. But the two of them together form the sufficient condition. So if you have both of them, you will then definitely have G. Writing this out on the actual diagram that we have here, we can say, just sticking it on, beginning of top chain, where we have G already. So H and D together guarantee G. Make that a little cleaner for you. So H and D, then G. I use the bracket and the plus together to reflect the word, the and, in the sufficient condition. Maybe one of those would be enough, maybe just the bracket alone, but then it starts to look a little bit like some ordering game style. So I wouldn't do that. I use both for this. That's me personally. You do what works for you, but that's one idea. Questions regarding the nature of this rule? I know it's a little bit different and we didn't have this previously. I suppose the real question that could come up here is how do you do the contrapositive? That could become a little bit messy. Got some comments chatting about this. Yeah, so we have the or in the contrapositive translation. That's really the key here. So if we have and in the sufficient, when we take the contrapositive, we will have or in the necessary. So contrapositive means you reverse and negate. That's typically how we talk about it, but there's the extra component of translating and or as well. Typically not a big deal, but comes up a lot in certain logic games rules. Some questions here I want to address here. First, I'll get to those, but first I want to actually just close the loop on translating this specifically. So when we have and in the sufficient, we have or in the necessary. Yes, Virginia, we do put it on the bottom chain. So positive G in the original becomes negative G in the contrapositive. We had and in the sufficient. We have or in the necessary. So the word or, I use a dotted arrow. If you want to, we can write the word or here just to remind us. And yes, the word or is inclusive here as well. Not exclusive, inclusive. So or, once again, includes the possibility of both. H and D were positive in the original. Now they're negative in the necessary. I saw Natalie's comment, then or is inclusive, so either is a better wording, or am I going too deep into the or world? I don't love using the word either, because to me, either or in everyday speech is really associated with exclusivity, and here we are dealing with inclusivity. Meaning, basically, here, if you lack G, then you will lack at least one of H or D. And maybe you will lack both. Does that address your question, Natalie?
Yes, thank you. I'm just having a hard time understanding the inclusivity of or, but it's making more sense.
Cool, fantastic. I mean, just to talk through it again, here we're saying if we have both H and D together, then we will have G. So if you ever see both H and D positive, you will then have G positive as well. Flip side, meaning the contrapositive, if we lack G, then we must not have had at least one of H or D, and maybe both of them would be out as well. So we had a question regarding, is it worth drawing out the original chain and the contrapositive chain? From Ariel. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much exactly what we did here. And I think this is useful because it gives us both sides of what these rules mean. So if we have a question saying, if I is negative, then what must be true? Well, if I is negative, we simply follow the chain along. So if I is negative, J is negative, E is positive, G is negative, and then at least one of H or D must be negative as well. However, if we had a rule saying if J is negative, then we can keep going down the chain, but we don't know where I is. So we follow the arrows simply in the direction in which they're pointing, going forward, in this case, to the right. And that's really the whole point of doing this. We're making inferences here, and those inferences will allow us to smoothly solve the questions. I know it took quite a while to get here, but the reason we're doing this is, first of all, it's taking longer to talk through it than to actually do it on test day. In test day, you could do this in this diagram specifically in maybe 2-3 minutes if you've practiced it sufficiently, meaning you are proficient at taking contrapositives. And we'll do some questions here as well, just to talk through it. Regarding Casey's question here, we're phrasing it as it's not possible to have both H and D together if we don't have G, going to cause problems in other cases. Yeah, that's not what this means. So if we're saying not possible to have both H and D together, no, you could have both H and D together. Even if you don't have G, you will lack at least one of H and D. That's true. But I think the problem here is that it's possible to mistakenly read this as saying that H and D are never together, period. The focus here is not them not being together. The focus is that they're not both in when G is out. That clears it up?
Yeah, I did the mistaken reversal in my head, so that actually makes a lot of sense.
That's so cool. Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. Tell me more about what the mistaken reversal looked like for you.
I was essentially saying that, like, thinking if we don't have G, then it's not possible to have both, like phrasing it like we don't have H and D together. That's not the case. as you said.
So if you were looking up here, like if you do have G or if you don't.
I was trying to take the contrapositive and say, so I said, if we don't have G, then it's not the case that we have H and D together.
So if we don't have G, not the case that we don't already, it's double negative framing, right?
Yeah, I think I just phrased it wrong in my head because I understand the diagram now, but I was just phrasing it in a way that wasn't actually correct. Like I was saying in my head that if we don't have G, then we can't have both H and D together.
Which is true. You cannot have both of them together in.
So that's what I was saying then. So can you phrase it that way?
If you do not have G, I'll say lack, because it already removes some of the negativity in terms of using the word not. If you lack G, then you must lack at least one of H or D. And because you will lack at least one of H or D, you will then also not have them both in. Now, as Liz is saying, they could be out together. They could both be out, and the world of out allows for them to be in the same place at the same time. They're just not in together.
Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is technically true, but I think the wording is potentially confusing and might not serve you, especially if you're doing it in your head where it's easy to mix things up. I mean, for me, the whole point of diagramming is to do less in your head.
Mm-hmm.
If you can simply read the diagram, you don't run the risk of getting lost in that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think the way you put it makes a lot more sense to diagram out that way.
Yeah, sure. And this is just the main diagram. I mean, one other thing you can do is you can draw a T-chart where you then say, okay, well, if G is out, then you must lack at least one of H or D as well. Now, could both H and D be in this out column? Yeah, they could. So they could both be out. They just could not both be in. So how do y'all feel about getting into some questions here? Yeah? All right, so let's take a look at the first one. Complete an accurate list of bills the legislator votes against. General orientation question with a little bit of a twist. Anybody knows the twist? Has anybody tried this one yet already? On an easy, hard?
The twist is that they're asking for what isn't possible versus what is possible.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, I think when you say not possible, do you mean against?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I think we're typically likely to think of things in positive terms rather than negative terms on average. And that's not what's going on here. We're thinking about the against category, the negative specifically. So if we're making that little T-chart, we're then thinking in the column on the right specifically, not the column on the left. So we follow the negatives along the chain going forward. And as Alyssa points out, we've got to think about in as well in many cases here. So following the chain, an approach you could take is look at negatives to start. When you exhaust that, you could then look at positives. So negatives perhaps would be looking at negative I to begin with and following it forward. So any choice mentioning negative I must also mention negative J, negative G, at least one of negative H and negative D as well. And then, of course, E could not appear in that same list. So what are some choices mentioning I here to start with? So B, as Anika says, mentions negative I. Do we also have negative J there? Nope, J is not listed. So choice B, automatically out. Choice C also mentions negative I. It does have negative J as well. Doesn't have E in it, so that's good. But it's missing G. It's missing gun control. Exactly, Marisa. So for that reason, C is out as well. I saw Billy even mention both of those earlier at the start. Fantastic. We look through the other choices. No mentions of negative I except A, right? A has negative I, so let's circle back there. A mentions I, mentions J as well. Doesn't mention E, which is good. Mentions G, which is also good. But getting to the very end, it's lacking any mention of H or D. So, no good on that one. And feel free to pause me or interrupt me if there's questions about this. Just knocking them out. Down to D and E. Anybody have guidance where we go from here? Write out what's in. Nice. Okay, so if D has E, G, H, J, that leaves D, F, I. Does that work? Yes, fantastic, Ariel's got it. Both E and J are voted against in this list. And our rule, the third rule, says if we lack E, we have J. If we lack J, we have E. Nice. We could have also looked right here. Basically, instead of starting with negative I, we could have moved forward starting with negative J. And then by using negative J out, we could then say, okay, well, E should be in. No choice can mention both E and J. So for that reason, D's out, E's our answer. And yes, Casey, the top diagram would have worked equally well here also. Top diagram would say negative E, then positive J. Again, telling you at least one of those two has to be in. They cannot both be out, in the negative column being against. This does get a little bit trickier because, as Alyssa said, it's useful thing of what's mentioned in the positive category unstated. Or the other approach would be to go a little bit forward on the diagram. These two diagrams do not have to both happen in their entirety. They do happen to serve as valid scenarios, but really they're mappings of relationships. And so if you exhaust the usefulness of starting with negative I, you can then move forward to start with negative J and continue from there. And interpreting this takes a lot of work. I mean, I agree that it's beautiful as well, Alyssa. Maybe my handwriting is not going to win awards, but it maps the relationships. And interpreting it takes some work. I see a question from Anika, then I want to move on to the Socratic review method with this. If I were looking for not G, wouldn't that mean E was in? Good question. This is part of interpretation here. So negative G. Let's say we have an if local question. If G is out, we were asked what must be true. If G is out, we can then say at least one of H or D, as in delta, is out. At least one of those two things must happen. Possibly both, because or is inclusive. But to say positive E is going backwards on the arrow, no good. We can only follow arrows in the direction in which they're pointing. So if we're told as a local limitation, if G is negative, what must be true? We can only go to the right. That's all that's allowed. That's good. That's okay. but you can't go backwards. Does that address the question, Anika? Awesome. Fantastic. So I'm going to leave off here with the walkthrough of the questions for this game. I've covered them before in other videos in the course as well, covered them, I think, on the website as well. But I wanted to talk a little bit, at least, about Socratic review method as it could be applied to logic games. So I'll have the recording here if you folks want to look at this later. For now, I'm going to share with you a link in the chat about my write-up, which is kind of like a version 1.0 of this concept. And of course, I welcome your ideas on where to take this next. And I'll screen share my document as well. So basically, instead of looking at stimulus or passage, question stem, answer choices, I'm thinking about the initial paragraph, which gives you a sense typically of what game type you're dealing with, the rules, then the questions and the choices. Typically, it's not going to be answer choices in logic games because logic games don't have the same ambiguities of language as logical reasoning and reading comprehension do. It's going to be much more about, again, initial paragraph or rules and the questions starting off. But that's just a simple jumping off point. I think what's much more interesting is your process. So when you're analyzing what happened, it could be the paragraph to start with, the rules, but also what was your inference making process like? Was something potentially lacking in that inference making process? You saw we took the entire session pretty much tonight focused on making that setup, making those inferences, connecting things together. Then there's the question of interpreting your main diagram, meaning in this case, are you reading the conditional statements correctly as they've been linked together? It takes some work. Even talking through it, it's still possible to misinterpret things, to go backwards on the arrows. And so that takes time to really understand the language of what a diagram could look like. You might have potential issues with understanding the questions in particular. We have questions like orientation, local, global. For how many will be determined, how many variables placements are determined, or alternatively, the diagram is fully determined if which one of the following is true. Or you might have rule substitution questions. Sometimes those wordings might trip you up. Sometimes the concepts they're asking about might trip you up. So understanding questions can actually be tricky sometimes in logic games, even if they don't have the ambiguities of language specifically, especially if you haven't seen it before or if it's a less common question stem type. You might look at to what extent have you reused previous work, previous local hypothetical scenarios. Oftentimes, I think students don't reuse previous work as much as they could have, but that's an incredibly efficient way to save time. Then you might look at how you approached the questions themselves. What order did you approach them in? I typically recommend, if possible, orientation, then local, then global questions. So doing these first three in that specific order, and then these other three perhaps later in the process. But given to you on test day itself within a game, the questions are pretty scrambled. And so it's your choice if you want to do them out of order in an order that may work better for you. Alon, I got to your question at the end. Game types, there are many, many different categorizations, but broadly speaking, you have ordering, grouping, combination, and then more rare game types. You have subtypes within those, but speaking broadly here. And so if you notice that you have trouble with one game type over another, you may want to explore that particular game type further in isolation, drilling it on the side, not only doing them in the context of a full section, because you want to better see the patterns in terms of the concepts that they're testing you on. If you're having trouble with a certain question type, you may want to drill that separately. Orientations are generally an easier, quote unquote, warm-up question. So I wouldn't expect those typically give a lot of trouble, but if they do, you could drill those. Much more common is to have trouble with rule substitution questions. And for those who have trouble with those, I know it's a common problem area. I taught a whole class on those recently they're linked right here. So you may want to look at those in isolation and work on those specifically. I have recommendations regarding drilling there, or maybe just tough curveball games that are rare or unique in some way. You might drill those, or I have a list of hardest games you could look at. I also have categorizations here for the vast majority of logic game types. Maybe it's fundamentals you want to review. Maybe you want to watch the masterclass videos I've taught on different strategies, or use my explanations. Higher level strategy would be writing your own logic games. So these are some different types of steps you might take based on whatever typically gives you the most trouble in games, or if you're just looking to reach your next level, plenty of tough things to be working on here. So, and again, I think the biggest area of Socratic review method to look at would be this: potential guiding questions for next steps you could take. If something gave you trouble in your understanding of the game type or in the rules, you might start there. You might write something out talking about how, just based on my discussion with Alana earlier, it might be something like, I initially thought this might be a process game, which intimidated me because it's a typical problem area. And I'm just making up parts. I don't remember all the details, but that's not the point here. I saw there was an ordering component involving days of the week, but I disregarded that due to other components that I had difficulty understanding. I'm just making that up there. Upon reflection, the initial paragraph was focused on chronology specifically, so the ordering component ended up being the most important action step. Focus on process, slow down, and focus on the major task at hand. So your review could involve something like that. Or if in the game we just did, the rules give you trouble, like maybe the rule with the word unless, you might say, okay, well, the second rule of the legislator game involved the word unless. I wasn't confident in how to translate this and messed up on interpreting it. Action step, drill unless in both LR and LG, focusing on both methods of translation. Or with regard to making inferences, it could be something like, I don't spend enough time making inferences up front. Or maybe I spend too much time making inferences up front when it's not serving me anymore. Or maybe with question solving order of approach, it could be something around, my default is to simply do them in order. And upon reflection, I've tried out both ways. And it turns out that doing them in a deliberate order, orientation, local, global, ends up being more efficient because it allows me to maximize use of previous work. So just some different critical analysis things to look at after the fact. So some great comments in the chat here I want to call attention to a little bit. Yeah, so could be true except, must be false except. Translating those question stems is really useful. I summarize them here as could and must, but in reality, of course, there's a lot more nuance. There's could be true, could be false, must be true, must be false, and then except, which changes everything. So maybe slowing down and translating those question stems specifically as an exercise. As for your question, Alana, about in that question number one I was talking about earlier that we worked through, the voting against was specific to that particular question stem. Just to copy that question in here. I'm gonna put this in the chat for everybody. You probably saw it already. That was limited to question number one. I mean, the against there. Moving forward, it's all based on whatever they're asking you in the next question. So question number 2 has a local if limitation. If a legislator votes against judicial activism, then what cannot be true? You take that as a separate individual situation.
No, I think what I meant was like when I'm looking at this question, I'm kind of misinterpreting it because I'm thinking it means like what is the complete I'm looking at it as like what is the complete and accurate list of all entities that the legislator might vote against. And so I thought it was like a complete and accurate list, and I think it's just pertaining to like what's available in the answer choices, right?
Well, we're saying the question says could be a complete and accurate list. So this is a full scenario, but remember that diagram I drew was only on the right side of that column, the negative side of the column.
Mm-hmm. So when it's saying what could be, it's kind of different than which of the following is a complete and accurate list, because like that is what must be true, and this is what could be true. This is basically like a complete and accurate list could be true question.
Well, to me, this is an orientation question. It's a partial orientation question. But when we're saying could be a complete and accurate list of those voted against, it's one possible scenario of many.
I got it. Okay, got it. That's very clear to me. Because I was trying to think, wait, how come that isn't also on the list? And I'm now realizing that it was sort of like starting with, I think you started with J and then looking at testing the answer choices.
Yeah, I started with negative J and then went forward. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Glad to help. So I'm wondering, before we wrap up, anyone has any general comments or questions around these guiding questions for Socratic review method applied to logic games specifically? This is a work in progress. I'll probably add to this document and modify it as a template, but I added some general ideas on what sort of analysis or reflections you might do based on whatever is giving you trouble in games, with ideas for going forward. But yeah, getting some positive feedback here. I mean, yeah, please reach out if you have questions or suggestions for different directions to potentially take this. I'll definitely make this part of an ongoing conversation around how to review logic games better, analyzing different elements of the process. So please reach out with questions or feedback. I'm happy to take into consideration, and we can continue fleshing this out going forward whenever we cover logic games. But if nothing else for now, I suppose we could leave off here for tonight, and we'll continue exploring it going forward. But thanks to all of you for joining. Great questions, great participation. As always, we have logical reasoning coming up tomorrow night, focused on flaw questions with an eye towards abstract language in flaws, specifically as discussed, as Ariel mentioned recently. And so I'm taking that